In the great Smoky Mountains, the forest can feel alive. Branches whisper, shadows shift, and silence carries its own weight. But on Father's Day weekend, 1969, that silence swallowed a 6-year-old boy right in front of his family and never gave him back. His name was Dennis Lloyd Martin. He was small, wiry, full of mischief, and dressed in a bright red shirt that should have made him easy to spot against the green of Spence Field. That Saturday afternoon, Dennis and his brother were playing with other children, plotting a prank. They'd crouch in the brush, leap out, and scare the adults on the trail. A simple game. A child's game. Bill Martin, Dennis's father, saw the boys duck behind bushes. He glanced away for only a moment. When the other children jumped out laughing, Dennis never reappeared. 5 minutes had passed. Then 10. Panic rose like a tide. Bill sprinted down the trail. 2 miles of rugged terrain, certain he'd catch sight of his son. But the path was empty. The brush was still. Dennis was gone. And then the sky broke open. A violent storm hammered the mountain. 3 inches of rain fell in hours. Trails turned to rivers. Creeks swelled and roared, and the temperature dropped into the 50s. In a single night, the forest became hostile. When rangers arrived, it was already too late for an easy rescue. Footprints had been washed away. Dogs couldn't hold a scent. What had been a family camping trip turned into one of the largest and most baffling searches in national park history. More than 1,400 people, rangers, soldiers, volunteers, scoured 56 square miles of unforgiving terrain. They climbed ridges, slashed through laurel thickets, swept creek beds, and shouted his name until their throats went raw. But the forest answered with nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not one trace of Dennis. A child had vanished in plain sight, in the middle of a crowded campsite, with his family only steps away. And for more than half a century, the Great Smokies have kept their secret. This was not just another missing person case. It became a national obsession, a haunting legend, and a question that still claws at every parent's deepest fear. How can a child disappear so completely, and why has he never been found? They called it the largest search in Smoky's history. The phrase is accurate and bland. It understates the chaos. Imagine a patchwork of people. Seasoned rangers who knew the moods of hollows, Boy Scouts with braided laces, Army reservists marched in rigid lines, civilian volunteers with flashlights and tin coffee cups, all thrown into the thicket with little central coordination. Radio communications existed but weren't as reliable as they are now. Maps were paper, and the map's grid cannot account for the animal paths or the ravines that hide a person from sight but not from the imagination. Search and rescue doctrine would later borrow the phrase "too many cooks" to describe what happened. And excessive searchers reduced effectiveness because inexperienced volunteers wandered into areas that needed systematic, methodical coverage. The U.S. Coast Guard and SAR training studies have used this case as a cautionary tale, a high-cost operation with no result. Personnel logs, expense sheets, and after-action reviews listed everything from vehicle mileage to the number of personnel from other agencies. The price tag, adjusted even slightly, became an argument that more bodies in the field didn't necessarily equal success. FORSCOM, +1. Planes from the Civil Air Patrol scanned ridgelines. Riders attempted to probe creeks. Dogs were brought in. But the rain had a way of erasing a scent the way a child erases a name from a chalkboard. In the hours and days that followed, searchers combed 56 square miles, a staggering area with hummock and gully, with blind hollows that could hide a person for a long time. They called in people with rope skills to attempt steep rock faces. They pitched bivouacs on ridges and established command posts under spruce. They posted flyers and followed up on dozens of leads from eyewitness reports. Leads were many, but each came with the ache of uncertainty. Some people claimed to have seen a small child in the days after the disappearance. An old man later told park officials he'd found skeletal remains of what he believed to be a small child in Big Hollow near Tremont. A discovery he said he'd kept secret for years because he feared prosecution for illegally harvesting ginseng. A subsequent search of that area turned up nothing confirmable. The claim added to the rumor mill, added heat to the family's hope and to the public's frustration. Wikipedia, +1. Then there was the unnerving report from tourists who heard a scream. Harold Key and his family said that roughly an hour after the disappearance, they heard an enormous, sickening scream and later saw a ragged man running up a trail 5 miles away, carrying cloth or clothing on his shoulder. Key's sighting was relayed to investigators and to local press. The distance between the sighting and Spence Field and the geography between them complicated any connection. By trail, the area between the purported sighting and the disappearance was longer, and the terrain was of the sort that chews up time and energy. Park rangers and the FBI concluded there was insufficient evidence to link the sighting to Dennis's disappearance. But in the public eye, the image of a ragged man running through the woods with a bundle grew into one of the case's most haunting refrains. Wikipedia. Search doctrine evolved after the operation. Park managers looked at how they had marshaled volunteers and concluded that uncoordinated mass searches can be counterproductive. The case became a reference point for improvements: better incident command systems, stricter volunteer control, improved training for volunteer coordinators, and later, better interagency radio protocols. The gap between the public's will to help and the operational need for organized action became a lesson written in wet footprints across the Smokies. Meanwhile, the family had to live through each public beating and private hour. The searchers' radios squawked, news vans waited at trailheads, and each new rumor would raise hope, then drop it. The mechanics of the search were not just technical, they were moral theater. Entire communities investing themselves into recovery of a single child, yet at days and returning to bed with the same unresolved question. The nervousness of millions can be concentrated in the question that keeps parents from sleep. Is there anything more I could have done? A disappearance near a national park is a blank into which people project their worst stories. The Dennis Martin case offered 3 basic theories, each one a story that makes sense to different kinds of fear: loss and perish, taken by an animal, or abducted and removed from the park. All 3 carried their own logic and their own unsolvable corners. The simplest, and to many the most likely, is that Dennis became disoriented and succumbed to exposure or accident. The Smokies are not forgiving. Steep drops, sudden weather changes, and dense laurel that can obscure a child's trail make a small body hard to find. Those who favor this theory point out how quickly the storm erased tracks and how creeks, swollen by that 3-inch downpour, could carry a small child away from visible paths. Park officials have often suggested that this is the most probable explanation. Wikipedia. The animal theory has a cinematic logic. A bear or feral hog takes a curious child. Witnesses regularly report bear sightings in the Smokies, and bears can create an abrupt, final ending. But there are problems. An animal attack that produced visible evidence, torn clothing, blood, obvious disturbance, would typically leave traces that searchers find, especially when thousands are looking. That absence of confirmable animal attack markers makes this theory less clean. Still, the fear of being taken by a wild thing persists in the public imagination and in the nightmares of anyone who's been alone in a thick wood at dusk. Wikipedia. The abduction theory is the one that transformed into rumor and then into legend. Dennis's father was a proponent of the possibility that someone had taken his son. The tourist Harold Keyes report a ragged man running with what looked like clothing, and the later stories about sightings of suspicious people fed that belief. The FBI investigated possible leads. Yet investigatory records, when they exist in public form, show the limits of evidence. No forensic trace linked a person to Dennis in a way that could be proven in court. In the months and years that followed, the suggested suspects remained suggestions. Names on a list with no cigarette but to match a child's fibers. No eyewitness who could place a suspect close enough at a verifiable time. The abduction theory has a social effect. It turned a wilderness tragedy into a human treachery, and that is a different kind of grief. Adding to the confusion, a man years later claimed he had found skeletal remains of a small child near Big Hollow, but had kept quiet because he illegally harvested ginseng and feared legal consequences. He told park staff only years after the disappearance. When rangers searched the location, they found nothing that could be confirmed as Dennis. The inability to confirm the find only deepened suspicion and frustration. If the remains had been Dennis's, the family would have had closure, and theory would have hardened into fact. Instead, silence and unconfirmed claims did something else. They made the case porous to speculation. Web sleuths. +1. Every theory also created behavior. People revisited the trail. Investigators reopened leads. Families of other missing children watched with painful interest. Writers and podcasters returned to the story every few years, each time layering on new conjecture. The more plausible theories sounded, the more people wanted to believe it, because belief allows an ending, even if it's the hardest kind of ending. But the stubborn thing about this disappearance is that none of the narratives can claim enough evidence to turn fear into certainty. And when proof is absent, the story does not die. It metastasizes into rumor, into folklore. It feeds forums and late-night radio and the quiet conversations that begin with, "Do you remember when?" That is one of the case's ironies. The less we know, the more people claim to know, and the louder the story becomes in the public ear. Bill Martin was not just a grieving father. He was a man who refused to accept silence from the mountains. In those first nights, he slept little, pacing the ridgelines with a flashlight, replaying the moment over and over. He had seen Dennis crouch down. He had turned his head for seconds. Seconds! And when he looked again, his youngest son had simply ceased to exist. The official search was massive, but as days bled into weeks, hope shrank. Food, water, warmth. A 6-year-old couldn't survive long in conditions like that. Rangers began speaking in softer tones, using words like recovery instead of rescue. But Bill never shifted. For him, Dennis was alive somewhere, needing to be found. He offered a $5,000 reward, an enormous sum in 1969, to anyone who could bring information. Tips poured in: possible sightings, scraps of rumor, whispers about strangers on the trails. Bill chased every one of them. He wrote letters. He made phone calls. He pressed investigators, reporters, even strangers, refusing to let his son's face fade into the static of other tragedies. What gnawed at him most was a report that came from another family visiting the park that very afternoon. The Key family. Harold Key and his children were miles away, near Rowan's Creek, when they claimed to hear a terrifying scream. Soon after, they said they saw a man, disheveled, strange, moving quickly through the woods with something over his shoulder. The Keys insisted the timing lined up. Could Dennis have been abducted? Could someone have snatched him during that tiny window of innocence and slipped away into the woods? For Bill, that theory fit too neatly to ignore. He clung to it. He spoke it aloud even when Rangers dismissed it as improbable. The FBI looked into the claim, but the distance and terrain made the connection thin. Still, the image remained: a ragged man running, a child screaming, and a father tormented by the thought that his son had been stolen, not by the forest, but by human hands. As years went by, Bill returned to the Smokies over and over. Some reports say he hiked the same trails until his body gave out, scanning the earth for a bone, a shoe, any shred of proof. He lived his life in the shadow of that unanswered scream. And in the cruel silence of the mountains, that theory, that Dennis was taken, became the one he carried to his grave. Years later, when the case had already hardened into legend, a strange confession surfaced. A man came forward claiming he had stumbled upon skeletal remains of a small child deep in the Smokies, in a place called Big Hollow near Tremont. He admitted he hadn't reported at the time because he had been illegally harvesting ginseng and feared prosecution. The bones, he claimed, were real. The size matched a child, and he had left them there. When Rangers heard the story, they mounted a search of the site. They combed the hollow, raked through leaf litter, examined the soil, but nothing was found that could be tied to Dennis. If bones had once been there, they were gone. If the man's story was true, time and weather had swallowed the evidence. The claim shook the case. On one hand, it offered the family a brutal kind of closure. Dennis had died in the wilderness, his remains hidden until chance uncovered them. On the other hand, it raised a darker suspicion. Had someone known more than they admitted? Had the man truly found remains? Or was another ghost story layered onto an already haunted landscape? For the Martin family, the report was salt in an old wound. To hope for decades, then to hear that bones may have been found and lost. It felt like betrayal by both nature and man. But this was not the only rumor. Over the years, countless sightings appeared. Children who resembled Dennis, people in nearby towns whispering about a boy kept hidden, stories that leaned closer to folklore than fact. Each one collapsed under scrutiny, but they kept the case alive in the public imagination. And in the Smokies, hikers kept telling stories. Strange sounds in the hollows, the feeling of being watched, the whisper that the forest had taken something and was not about to give it back. It is here that the story shifted from a missing person case into something larger. Dennis's disappearance became part of the Smokies' mythology, the way some places are said to be cursed, the way some trails seem colder than others at night. For every ranger who gave a logical explanation, there was a hiker who told a darker one. The facts were already too thin to settle the case. But the rumors, the bones, the scream, the strange man running, ensured the disappearance would never be forgotten. The disappearance of Dennis Martin was not just a personal tragedy. It reshaped the way America thought about search and rescue. The Great Smoky Mountains search was unprecedented in size. Over 1,400 people swarmed the park: rangers, soldiers, volunteers, Boy Scouts. But what should have been an advantage turned into a liability. Inexperienced searchers trampled potential evidence. Areas were covered haphazardly. Communication broke down. What began as a rescue effort spiraled into chaos. When the operation finally wound down, it was declared the largest search in the park's history, and a failure. Not a single piece of Dennis's clothing, not one definitive footprint, not one trace. The embarrassment was public, and the lessons became urgent. In the aftermath, search and rescue protocols across the country changed. The Dennis Martin case became a cautionary tale taught in training. No longer would volunteers flood a scene without control. Incident command systems were developed to streamline operations, ensuring that every search had a chain of command, clear communication, and disciplined coverage of terrain. Later generations of rangers and rescuers would cite Dennis's disappearance as a turning point, the tragedy that forced modern standards. Yet for the Martin family, that was no comfort. Policy improvements could not return their boy. What they lived with was the echo of unanswered questions. To some, Dennis became the Smokies' ghost child, a name spoken on trails, a reminder to parents to hold their children close. To others, he was proof that wilderness holds dangers deeper than most people admit. And to many rescuers, he was a haunting reminder that even massive resources can fail when the smallest window of time is missed. 50 years later, hikers still walk through Spence Field. They see the ridges and valleys much as the Martins saw them in 1969. The grass still rolls and waves. The wind still carries through laurel and spruce. But for those who know the story, the place feels heavier, like the ground is holding something just beneath the surface. Dennis Martin never came home. And in the wake of his disappearance, the very way America searches for the lost was forever altered. By the second week of the search, the case had outgrown the park. The sheer strangeness, a child vanishing in seconds, a scream reported miles away, a ragged man seen running, demanded more than rangers with maps and volunteers with flashlights. The FBI joined the investigation. Agents interviewed the Key family, who stood firm on their account of hearing a blood-curdling scream and seeing a man moving swiftly through the woods with something slung over his shoulder. Agents also spoke with locals, hunters, and anyone whose timeline put them near Spence Field. But the Smokies weren't a city block. There were thousands of square miles of ridges, hollows, and caves. A kidnapper, if there was one, could disappear into small mountain towns, move through state lines, or vanish as completely as the boy himself. The Bureau chased every thread. They looked into known offenders in the region. They considered the possibility of transient criminals. But without a body, clothing, or a single verified item belonging to Dennis, the FBI hit a wall. Evidence was speculation. Sightings contradicted one another. By the time the Bureau withdrew, the case was still as empty as the moment Dennis vanished. Officially, the FBI never declared abduction a proven theory. But unofficially, the whisper stayed alive. If a boy in bright red can vanish while surrounded by family, maybe it wasn't nature that took him. Maybe it was someone darker. In the years that followed, the Martin family tried to live, but they were never free. Bill Martin's grief hardened into obsession. He spent decades chasing every rumor, every whispered lead. His wife, Barbara, bore the quieter suffering, the empty room, the birthdays unmarked, the ache of not knowing her youngest had called out for her in those final hours. Douglas, Dennis's older brother, carried survivor's guilt. He had been there in the grass, crouched with Dennis, planning the prank. He had jumped out laughing. He had lived. That simple fact followed him through adolescence, adulthood, and into his own family life. Reporters who tracked him down decades later found him reluctant to speak. Some wounds stay raw even after half a century. Grandfather Clyde, who had hiked with him that day, died with the same unanswered questions. For the Martins, the disappearance was not just a missing person case. It was a fracture that never healed, a silence that lasted through generations. And still, strangers kept asking. They wrote letters. They speculated on radio shows. They told the story to their children on Smoky Mountain hikes. This is where the boy went missing. For the family, there was no escape. Dennis became public property, a legend carved into wilderness, while the Martins carried the private agony of never seeing his body, never burying their child, never saying goodbye. As the decades passed, the facts of the case grew thinner and the legends grew thicker. Hikers told stories of strange sounds in Spence Field, a child's cry echoing through the trees, or laughter carried on the wind. Others whispered about shadowy figures moving the tree line, just out of sight. Locals told and retold the story of the ragged man running with something on his shoulder. The Smokies became not only a place of beauty, but a place haunted by absence. Writers folded Dennis's story into broader narratives, into tales of national park disappearances, into campfire lore, into theories that suggested something unnatural lurked in the mountains. Some claimed feral people lived deep in the hollows. Others tied it to Bigfoot sightings or paranormal events. None of it could be proven. All of it kept the story alive. But beneath the folklore sat an uncomfortable truth. Thousands had searched for Dennis with every modern resource available in 1969, and they had found nothing. No bones, no clothing, not even a shoe. That void is what fed the legends. Because when the forest refuses to give an answer, people invent their own. More than 50 years have passed since Dennis Martin vanished, but his story has never faded. It remains one of the most haunting disappearances in U.S. national park history. Every June, visitors to Spence Field walk the same grassy clearing where Dennis last played. Families set down packs. Children laugh. Hikers eat their lunches. And if they know the story, they look into the trees a little longer than usual. They imagine a boy in a red shirt crouching behind the brush, waiting to jump out. They imagine turning their head for just a moment and never seeing him again. Search and rescue experts still study the case. Documentaries revisit it. Online communities debate theories endlessly. Was he lost, taken by wildlife, or abducted by a stranger? Every theory circles the same hollow center: absence. For the Martin family, the ache never ended. Bill carried his obsession until his death, convinced his son had been taken. Barbara lived in quiet grief. Douglas lives with the memory of the prank that went wrong. Their story is America's reminder that not every mystery is solvable. Not every child is found, and sometimes, even with thousands of eyes searching, the wilderness wins. The Great Smoky Mountains still hold Dennis Martin's secret. And unless the forest one day decides to give it back, the boy who vanished in plain sight will remain forever missing.